Hello and welcome to the Reactive Dog Pod. I am your host, Tess Morgan. I am a multi-certified dog behavior consultant who specializes in the treatment of reactivity in dogs. Through my business, Treat Yourself Dog Training and Behavior, I help clients make progress and enjoy life again with their reactive dogs. Join me and my guests as we dive into all things reactivity. We'll explore behavior concepts, talk about real-life training plans and considerations for reactive dogs, provide tips and tricks, and discuss how we can best help reactive dogs and their families thrive. Because reactive dogs are good dogs, they just need a little bit of extra support. Let's get into it. Enrichment, decompression, and resilience are buzzwords in the dog behavior community lately. But what do these words actually mean? How can we consider and incorporate them into our reactive dogs' lives? And why do behavior consultants consider these things must-haves rather than nice-to-haves in a dog training's journey? Our guest today is here to talk about just that. Chen is the owner and founder of Honourable Hound, a dog training company in Vancouver, Canada, that specializes in private lessons and group dog enrichment classes. She is a certified professional dog trainer, knowledge assessed, Aggression in Dogs Master Course graduate, and she is fear-free certified. She lives in Vancouver with her miniature Schnauzer, Neville, and her cat, June. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you, Tess. It's a pleasure to be here.
So with all of my guests, before we get started on our topic, pretty much everyone has had some kind of reactive dog in their life or some kind of experience with reactivity in their personal life. So do you want to tell me a little bit about Neville and whether you've ever dealt with reactivity personally?
Oh yeah, we've done that. So yes, Neville is definitely something where, I would consider him a reactive dog. It's a pretty broad label, but at the end of the day, if we're having a dog who's struggling with big feelings of some types, and those feelings are often spilling over into what the general public would consider an overreaction or an inappropriate reaction, he for sure falls under that label. Do you want to talk more about like the beginnings of reactivity? At this point in time, he's like 10, so we're also pretty far past the early stages of reactivity, where nowadays, if he sees a dog he doesn't like, he like does the equivalent of like grumbling under his breath as he like walks past them, because he's like not happy the fact that that dog's over there playing or having a fun time. But we're also not like hitting the end of the leash, having barking happening, lunging. Like that's been years since we've seen stuff like that.
Benefits of living with a trainer.
Yes, definitely.
Were you a trainer when he first became reactive, or when you first got him?
Yes, I was. It was pretty early on in my career. So it was something that was still new for me. So it was for sure a really big learning curve. But I think it's one of the reasons why I ended up doing so much reactivity, other than the fact that reactivity is probably like the most common behavioral problem, if not like for sure top 2, top 3. And it is normal, frankly, for dogs to experience some type of reactivity in their life.
Yeah, definitely worth normalizing, because I think a lot of people feel like they're alone in their dog's reactivity. And one thing we talk about a lot too on the podcast is like the dogs that you see on the patios and the dogs that you see ignoring everyone are the dogs that you see, because they're the ones that are being brought to the patios or being brought to the park. But that doesn't mean that that's the majority of dogs necessarily, right?
Totally. Yeah, it's very much so. I like to phrase it as you see them everywhere because they can go everywhere. And that does not mean that all dogs are like that.
Or even most dogs.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So we have kind of 3 topics today. We have resilience, we have decompression, we have enrichment. I want to start with enrichment. So before we start diving into enrichment and different types and how we can incorporate it, can we define enrichment? Would you define it by like specific activities or more by like the outcome of those activities?
So I think it wouldn't be wrong to define it either way. Personally, I define it as outcome. So I think in terms of outcome, enrichment should improve something. It should provide sensations of joy, satisfaction, fulfillment, etc. It's like it's increasing quality of life in some way. So in that sense, I like to think of it as outcome, because I find when we define enrichment as specific activities, we often get caught up in the activity itself and not so much whether or not the activity is providing the the purpose of enrichment. Is the activity actually creating joy? Is it creating satisfaction? Is it creating improved quality of life? Is that happening? So that's something that I think is important in general within the dog training world. I think that often we get really stuck in the idea of you have to do this thing in order to create this outcome. And really, what you want is the outcome. So, how you get there is something where often you can do whatever it is people are talking about, but sometimes that's not the right choice for your individual dog.
That's very true. And I also think there's like a component of what is natural for the dog to be doing day to day? What
Mm.
are natural activities for them? And how can we meet that need in our very kind of unnatural world?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Is making sure that when we are building an enrichment schedule or any type of care routine for anyone, frankly, you're really prioritizing the individual's need.
Mhm.
Where I feel often we can think about things like breed or age as kind of like a starting point for
Mhm.
understanding what this particular dog might need. But really, once you try it, if your dog's not responding to it, then skip it, move on to something else, figure out what works for your individual.
I'm thinking right now of a client I have that her dog has a really high prey drive. And
Mhm.
so I think all of us recommend flirt poles a lot because
Yeah.
they're just such an easy way to like get the energy out in a small environment or in your backyard or
Totally.
and then also for her, I was thinking, oh, this is great because the dog will practice chasing something in like a legal way. Dog
Mhm.
doesn't like the flirt pole. And it's kind of like, okay, well, do we put a whole lot of effort into trying to like train the dog to like the flirt pole? Or do we just say,
Yeah.
dog doesn't like the flirt pole, let's try something else, you know?
Totally. Yeah. I think that's something that's so important is figuring out what is like the path of least resistance too, because
Mm.
it also tends to be, I find, what's most sustainable. And that's something that's so important for dog training is that whatever you end up doing with your dog training wise, you need to be able to keep this up. It's not something you do for like, 2, 3 months and then your dog's fixed and then you never again have to do things anymore. Like, no, this is a lifestyle change. You have to be aware of what your dog needs and you have to be able to figure out how you are going to meet those needs.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit about different kind of categories of enrichment? And because I think a lot of people would think, okay, enrichment means sniffing or enrichment means puzzle toys, right? That's what comes to people's brains first is like a Kong or that
Yeah,
puzzle toy
food.
from the store, right? But there's a lot of different kind of categories of enrichment. Do you want to talk about a couple of them?
Yeah, I would love to. So I like to break down enrichment into like five overarching like umbrella categories essentially. So like you mentioned, there is food. That is probably the one that I think that most people think of the most. The secondary one of course would be sensory, so like sniffing. I think that also falls into the category of like sight-based enrichment, sound-based enrichment, touch-based enrichment, that kind of stuff, where you are stimulating your dog's senses and not just the nose essentially. I think other types of enrichment to be thinking about are social enrichment, both active socialization as well as passive socialization. And I think beyond that, physical enrichment is a really important one as well. And then one that we often don't really know how to approach, I find, is occupational or like a job or task oriented enrichment.
Mm.
I think all of those should be considered when we're building a care routine for a dog.
Yeah, yeah. And all of those have a component of like what that dog or what that breed would was bred to do or what
Yes.
their kind of innate needs are. A lot of people also consider like sleep enrichment
Mm,
is something that I've heard people say, and I
mhm.
would agree. I guess if we think about enrichment as like meeting the dog's overall needs, um,
Yeah.
agency is talked a lot about, like kind of
Yes.
incorporating agency and choice into
Mhm.
enrichment plans as well. Yeah, thank you for going through that. That's a good overview. Um, why do you think that we as trainers prescribe enrichment activities so often specifically for reactive dogs? Like why is enrichment so like it's obviously it's important for all dogs, but where does it kind of fall into our reactivity plan? Why is it so important for those dogs?
That's a really good question. So I think the answer to this kind of harkens back to something you said at the beginning of the podcast when we were talking about how owning a reactive dog can be really isolating. It can make you feel like you're alone and like no one else's dog is like this, and it's just you and your weird dog. When that's not true at all, it's very common. I think enrichment ultimately is about being able to expand your dog's world. It's about being able to meet their needs in a way that's not just like a walk around the block, because just because everyone talks about that, that doesn't mean it's the only way that you can be a good dog owner. It doesn't mean it's the only way you can exercise your dog. It doesn't mean it's the only way you can meet their needs. There
Mhm.
are hundreds of other ways that we can do all of those things. And enrichment is like the beginnings of understanding that there are other things that you can do that can make you happy, can make your dog happy, meet their needs, and get you to your goals.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing that comes to mind when I think about reactive dogs and enrichment is that, like you said, that walk around the block, A, might not meet that dog's exercise needs. For most dogs, I would say, unless they're kind of a more senior dog or a very chill dog, usually a
Mm,
walk around the block is not going to be enough. And then also, if your dog is reactive, you might be skipping walks some days or just doing pee breaks or just doing backyard stuff just to give your dog a chance to recover from the stresses of the previous walk or the previous day. And so I think a lot of people, especially people who have high energy breeds or young dogs that are reactive, are looking for ways to meet their needs when they can't do the typical dog stuff. And I think that's where enrichment comes in.
yeah, I fully agree. I think that's something that actually it's one of my favorite things about like dog Instagram and like dog TikTok is that enrichment has become such a big talking point for people. And it's very normalized in that sense, where I think that people are starting to realize that it's just like stuff you do with your dog. It's normal in the same way that I think when a lot of us were growing up, we heard of it as like, and then you take your dog out for a walk. That's what you're supposed to do with the dog. Now we're realizing that that's just like one of many options that we
Mhm.
can do.
Mhm. When you're working with a dog and you're starting to introduce more enrichment into their life,
Mm.
how do you figure out what an individual dog would benefit from or what they are benefiting from? And how do you know, like, okay, we need to change something, this isn't working for the dog?
That's a lovely question. So I think there's a couple different things that we're looking at. So the first thing that we do when we're working with a client is that we have an online intake. So it's 90 minutes. It's through an online video portal like Zoom or Google Meet or whatever. And we go through a super thorough intake form, essentially, where we're looking at the care routine, what your dog's day-to-day life is like, the problems that you're experiencing, what your goals are, all of that stuff. And we talk about all of it. So in that, we start to get a really good sense of what you're already doing, where you're already succeeding in terms of meeting your dog's needs, and where there are unmet needs, and what can we do about those unmet needs. Sometimes we're also working on optimizing needs that are already being met, but maybe they can be met in a way that's easier, or they can be met in a way that's more fulfilling. But oftentimes that's like smaller details that come later, but it depends on the person. So during that, that's often where we're kind of figuring out what needs to change, what needs to happen, what needs to be added, what needs to be reduced. And it's something where a lot of people actually, I find it's very surprising for them, don't realize that they're often overdoing it in certain categories. Like the number of people who have a dog that's like in daycare for 8 hours, 4 days a week. And we have to tell them that that's too much for their dog. That's part of the reason why their dog is struggling with a particular behavioral problem is because their dog is chronically overstimulated.
Mhm.
Sometimes there is an exception if they have a high quality daycare that involves, naps, break time, appropriate amounts of play, and there's more management happening in that daycare where sometimes that's okay. But I think that helping people understand where their dog is at, where they want to be, and what needs to change in order to figure out how to meet those needs. Like what you were talking about with your client that was dealing with prey drive as well, making sure that we have an appropriate outlet in place before we start training is really, really important, especially if we're dealing with a behavior that's just like a normal dog thing to do.
Mhm.
Dogs chase stuff, they have fun. It's a wonderful thing for them to do, maybe not for us, but it's super enriching for the dog. But if we don't like the way in which they express that normal behavior, it's our responsibility to find a way to give them that outlet in a way that they enjoy and we don't mind that they do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the Academy for Dog Trainers, which is the first kind of program I did,
Mm,
Jean Donaldson always says, give them a legal outlet, something legal,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that's a great, and that's a good example with that flirt pole dog is like that was, oh, my idea was a flirt pole, right? But the dog didn't like that. But that doesn't mean that aren't other ways that we can simulate chasing and hunting and all that kind of prey drive sequence with other toys or with other activities. Do you ever work with clients where you start an enrichment plan and then you think, this isn't right, I need to tweak something? And how do you kind of figure that out?
Yeah, it happens all the time. I think that because there are so many different types of enrichment, it's normal to like start with one thing and then see how it's working for you. And I find when it comes down to figuring out whether or not this is the right enrichment choice for your dog, these should be activities that your dog is interested and engaged in doing. Often they are purpose built. So the purpose of this particular type of enrichment is to give an outlet for an appropriate dog, like a normal dog behavior. Or it might be that the purpose of the enrichment is to provide decompression, or the purpose of the enrichment is to give like autonomy back to the dog and let the dog just do whatever it wants. And it really kind of depends on what need we're looking at trying to meet with that enrichment and whether or not we're seeing changes in that behavior. Like if we have a dog who is super frustrated on leash, for example, often that dog is frustrated because they're feeling like they can't do what they want to go and do. Whether or not that's appropriate, what they want to go and do is obviously a different story. But the fact that they feel frustrated needs to be addressed. We need to figure out why they feel frustrated and how we're going to help them not feel like their person is stopping them from doing all of the cool things that they want to go do, like run into traffic or chase squirrels or like whatever the dog's plan is. And whether or not we start to see changes in their behavior, where oftentimes once we get the care routine in place, once we increase enrichment here, decrease it there, and like do all the fiddling that needs to happen, the number of times that I see reactivity or any behavioral problem, quite a few of them actually, decrease is stunning. Where like we didn't have to do no clicker work, no sits, no downs, no engage, disengage, none of that like dog trainer retraining stuff. All you had to do was put your dog on a long line, stop going to daycare as much, and then go to a quiet field 2 or 3 times a week and just let them do whatever they want. It's surprising to so many people how big of a difference that makes. And it also really, I find, is heartening for a lot of people too, because oftentimes when you have a reactive dog, it feels like this big, giant, massive hill to climb where you're like, am I ever going to be able to do it? Am I ever going to be able to walk around the block or just walk anywhere without having to have my head on a swivel or be able to do those things that I thought I would be doing with my dog when I first got my dog, whether it be like, like the Sunset Beach Walk or sitting on a patio drinking a beer or a coffee or something like that. Are those things out of reach me forever? Or is it something that might one day be a thing for me? I think those are all things that are important.
Yeah, those are great points. And I was just thinking, because like almost every reactivity client, I'm like, stop walking in the neighborhood, find a field, get a long line. Like I prescribe that almost constantly too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because yes, it can definitely help you meet your goals to, like you said, walk in the neighborhood, walk to the store, sit on a patio. And also, some dogs are just not that dog. And I find that some people they start doing that and they say, you know what, this is what my dog enjoys. This is like a good bonding moment. My dog doesn't have to be avoiding triggers all the time because we're in a big field where we can get away easily. And they start to actually enjoy their dog again just by doing that instead of the like, in quotes, like normal dog stuff, right?
Yes, I think that for a lot of dog owners, there's so much like a societal pressure and expectations on what they should be doing with their dog that often it really messes with that person's ability to objectively look at what their dog actually wants to do, what that dog actually enjoys, what makes that dog happy, because we're so busy being told that this is what is supposed to make your dog happy, that it's hard for people to pull back and be like, he hates this. Like my personal dog, Neville, if I were to walk him around the block every day, he would be miserable. He would be so upset. He's the type of dog who's really quite territorial. And for some dogs, don't get me wrong, I do find that like going for their little like security patrol is enriching in some way, but for him, his body is tense the entire time. He's got a head on a swivel. Even if there's no dogs around, he is uncomfortable because he's like, it could happen. There could be evil monsters around the corner. And I'm like, okay, well, why don't we go anywhere else? And if we walk anywhere else that's not in the neighborhood, he's happy as a clam. He's busy enjoying himself. And I could try to train through that. And I could try to make him enjoy walks around the neighborhood by putting in an enrichment plan, doing a bunch of training, doing a bunch of management, or I could just not do any of that stuff and just put my dog in the car and go somewhere else, like even like a 2-minute drive to like 3 or 4 blocks away. He's happy as a clam because it's not near his house, and that's the part that stresses him out.
And it was interesting that you said that what the dog actually likes and what they hate. And it's also like, I think a lot of people hate walking their dog in the neighborhood and like they don't.
Mhm.
So, like, to realize, like, oh, I don't have to do that. The person actually can enjoy the walks again. So the dog and
Yeah.
the person can be happy, and the behavior can improve. So it's kind of like win-win. I think the biggest hump that I see people have is like, oh, I have to get in the car now, right? So like changing your outlook and your routine about like how you care for your dog and exercise your dog can be hard for people, even if it's just like a 2-minute drive.
Yes, yeah, the change in routine is difficult. I find that often a lot of the work that we end up doing is figuring out what, not only like what needs need to change, what we need to do, but also how are we going to implement that. So for a lot of people, doing like textbook perfect reactivity where you never walk your dog, reactivity training, I should say, where you never walk your dog around the block, you put them in the car 3 times a day, you drive them to an empty field somewhere, you put them on a long line, and you let them just do whatever they want, and then do some training too. That is fully unrealistic.
Mhm.
And that is something where it's really important to me that clients understand that this has to be sustainable. You have to be able to do this for the rest of your dog's life. And if that means you're getting your dog to that empty field 1, 2, or 3 times a week, great. That's
Mhm.
what it is.
Mhm.
Other times we are just looking at filling in those need deficits in other ways. So that might be doing something like going down to the parkade and long lining your dog in your apartment parkade and letting him just run around, especially if because here in rainy Vancouver, we have dogs who hate the rain. And
Mhm.
I got bad news for those dogs. It's pretty rainy here most of the year. So rather than making that dog walk in the rain, be miserable, already primed to be reactive because they're in the middle of being upset the entire walk because they're wet and they hate it,
Mhm.
just go downstairs and run around for 30 minutes near parkade and then go upstairs and then
Yeah.
wait for something like nicer weather and then go outside.
Yeah.
There's no need for you to force yourself or force your dog to do things that aren't helpful for you or your animal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I could keep talking on and on about this, but I think we should move on to resilience.
Yes.
This is one of the, I want to say, newer kind of words that is thrown around a lot lately.
Yeah.
There's a popular course right now that's running on resilience. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I love this concept. I think it's so important for reactive dogs. But before we talk more about it, just like we did with enrichment, can you talk about how you would define resilience, and what factors might make a dog more or less resilient?
Yeah. So personally, I like to define resiliency as the capacity to tolerate, move past, forget, or otherwise disregard an adverse experience of some type.
Okay. Um, so when I think about my personal dogs, I have two dogs. They're both anxious in different ways, but the one that I'm thinking of, the reactive one, she probably came from, I mean, based on what the rescue told me, like a puppy mill breeding type situation.
Mm-hmm.
So probably her genetics not amazing. They certainly were not breeding for resilience, which is an interesting thing that's happening now, is that breeders are talking a lot about breeding dogs that are more resilient.
Yeah.
And then she had some bad experiences before I was a trainer, and I kind of put her in bad situations with other dogs. And I think some dogs, had they had kind of the genetic makeup to be more resilient, may have bounced back because she wasn't attacked, right? She just was overwhelmed a few times. But because she was not predisposed to be resilient, she very quickly became anxious and reactive, and I hate all other dogs. And so I think that's an interesting example of, like, many dogs would have been like, you're crowding me a bit. I didn't like that, but I'm fine.
Yeah.
Whereas she was like, my life is ruined now and I hate dogs forever because of those two like overwhelming experiences. So I think like resilience is so interesting in that way, and it can kind of take the pressure off of us as dog guardians to know that like some dogs are more predisposed to not be able to bounce back as easily. But the good news is that we can improve resilience, or at least we're talking more now about how we can help dogs become more resilient. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you help your clients, and if we even can do that, or if it's more of like a set trait?
Yeah. So I think with resilience, like a lot of factors and like parts of personalities, it's a little bit of both nature and nurture. And I think understanding that helps people understand what they can change and what they can't change too, because I feel that sometimes, depending on who I'm working with, some people will come in with this idea that if only I had done XYZ, everything would have been perfect. There would be no problems. If I had just something filled in the blank here, then I wouldn't be here today, and I would have a perfect baby angel with no fears at home. And oftentimes, you could have done it all right, every single thing, and you would still be in exactly the same place. And being able to have people realize that it's not their fault. It's stuff happens, life happens. Some of it you can control, some of it you can't control. But the fact of the matter is, you just have to be in the moment of what you're dealing with right now, is something that helps people move on from like that grief process essentially that happens when you start to be like, oh, this is not going to be what I thought it was going to be. And you have to adapt and live in that moment, which in itself, I think, is a particular type of resilience for human beings too. So moving into your question about like, can we create resiliency? Can we improve it? I think the answer is yes, definitely. But I think the big question is, how much can we change it? How much can we move things around? When does it matter? Can we only do this in the first couple months of life when the dog's brain is still developing and it's still very plastic at that point? Does it get harder as the dog gets older, or does it get harder after they've had different types of experiences? I think these are all really good questions that I don't think we have that much data on yet. I think we're getting more data with people that helps us kind of get a better sense about what might be realistic. But in terms of understanding that resiliency with the dogs that are in our lives, I think that there's a lot of things that we can look at that can start to change how resilient our dog is. All of the factors out there may not apply to every single dog out there, but I think that's part of the process of doing training, is understanding of the 85,000 different factors that need to be considered, which ones do you need to care about?
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm looking at resiliency for a dog, oftentimes I'm considering things like decompression. How often is this dog getting the opportunity to go and decompress? Enrichment, what does their enrichment schedule look like? Are needs being met? Are they being met on a regular basis? How are they being met? Things like genetics, which we've already talked about, of course, which kind of set the stage for everything else. Um, when resilience is built, and if it was built early in life, like did we go to a puppy class? Did we have good experiences? Did we have bad experiences early in life? Did trauma happen at some point in time? Or are we looking a little bit further back? Like, do we have information on the parents, the mother, the father dog, the grandparents even? What was the mother's life like during pregnancy, before pregnancy? Those types of factors that will influence the hormones that she is giving to the puppy, that will help set that dog up in terms of how that dog perceives the world around them. I think other things that I tend to have people think about, or I'm thinking about it at the very least in the back of my head while I'm talking with people, is what kind of support that dog has. Does this dog have regular social support? Does it have secure attachment with its people? Is there a strong bond, or is it brand new? Is that dog brand new to its people and it's not really sure yet who they are, and it's a brand new relationship? And is that dog nervous because they're like, I don't know who you are, you seem nice, but I've known you for like 2 weeks?
Mm-hmm.
That's super normal, and I feel like there's 1,000 different kinds of factors that we can think about, but helping people understand which ones are important for them, I think, is what really matters here, so that the people aren't busy being like overwhelmed by
Mm-hmm.
all of the things to think about, because they're not all of them are going to be important for you.
Mm-hmm. One thing that came to mind while you were talking about secure attachment is, and I'm not going to go into this because this could go into a long conversation, but the use of aversive methods in training, prong collars, e-collars, all that stuff. Um,
Mhm.
we talk a lot about dogs being safe and feeling safe and secure with their person, knowing that they're not going to be put into a situation they can't handle. And if the person that you're relying on to feel safe is hurting you or doing something that's stressing you out, I think that can have a really negative impact on how resilient you are in the future.
Yes, I think that that's hugely important, because dogs are captive animals. They are dependent beings. They are 100% reliant upon us, their human being, to take care of their needs. And your dog is not a dummy. They know that to some extent. And when the person that's in charge of you is inconsistent, they're hot and cold, they're not listening to you when you're expressing that you're having a need that's not being met, or you're afraid, or you're stressed out, and they're ignoring that need, either because they don't think it's important or because they're not recognizing it. I find that's That's a really big one, is a lot of people just don't know. And then of course, once they know, then they can fix the problem. But making sure that your dog looks at you as a person that they feel safe with, a person where they can turn to when they have a problem and they're like, I got a problem. What
Hmm.
are we as a team going to do about the fact that there's a dog 25 feet away? Because that's a big deal. And then you can work with your dog at that point to be like, we are going to eat food and walk away, or
Hmm.
whatever is appropriate in that moment.
That's so big because that's one of the most beautiful moments about reactivity training is when dogs do start to say like, "Hey, I see a dog. Hi, what are we doing?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of having that immediate reaction. And then another thing that I think is really kind of tied in with resilience is recovery and how we see dogs when they're kind of further down, further along in their reactivity training journey, that they recover better. And we can give them more chances to say, you know what? I'm going to stop managing you so much and I'm just going to let you see the dog and I'm going to see what happens because we see that dogs start to say, okay, I saw that dog. Maybe I didn't love it, but I can recover and move on. I'm resilient, more resilient now than I would have been before we did this training.
Yes, I think that is such a beautiful moment when you start to see your dog be able to cope and handle things in a way that they were not previously able to do. And it's a wonderful moment where you're just like, ah, it's happening, it's working, things are
Hmm.
changing. And it just feels so validating to go through that. And I think on what you were saying about letting go a little bit, finding that moment where you've done enough work, enough prep work that you don't have to feel like you have to micromanage your dog all of the time. You can trust them to be able to either handle whatever they're feeling or to turn to you and say, hey, I'm having a problem, and then you help them work through that rather than just sort of micromanaging them, distracting them, keeping them busy, so that they just never have a moment where they get to like acknowledge that there's a trigger there, and they never have the opportunity to actually work through
Hmm.
whatever they're going through. And there's no opportunity for like desensitization to happen. And they're just stuck being like, if I just stare into your eyes forever, nothing bad will ever happen,
Yeah.
which, of course, is not really going to work long term unless you feel like having a dog be able to not engage at all with their environment and enjoy their life because they're busy being micromanaged by you in order to stop a reaction from happening rather than helping them learn how to actually deal with their triggers. I think
Hmm.
that's such an important thing to be working on and understanding the distinction between the two, because sometimes you do actually need to micromanage your dog. That happens, that's okay, especially in the beginning, but it's not a goal that you should be having long term. You should be able to let go and trust that your dog can either handle it or they could tell you they can't handle it, and then you step in and help them.
And sometimes I also want to say sometimes we make mistakes. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we have to try. Like, we're not going to try if we know it's a situation where the dog's way too close and they're definitely going to react. We're not going to
Yeah,
just let
yeah,
them
yeah.
handle it. But there are situations where we see, we try, we say, we worked on this for a while. I'm going to let you look. Sometimes the dog has a reaction. Okay, now we have information. Now that was too hard for the dog, but we tried, right? And so there's like kind of this delicate balance of like you said, knowing when to manage and knowing when to let them kind of observe and make the decision on their own. And sometimes we're not perfect. And even as a trainer, I've made bad calls where I've said, let's try waiting. And then the dog has a reaction. I'm like, oops, right? So if I'm making that mistake as a trainer, obviously you're going to make it as a guardian, and that's okay, but just try not to repeat that mistake over and over again. And if you do get that information, take that and say, okay, next time I'm going to try from further away.
Yeah, I think that's such an important concept to make sure that people are aware of and comfortable with, is the idea that you're not going to get it 100% right. It's not going to happen. You're gonna have moments where it's going to go bad, and that's okay. You will move past it. Your dog will get over it. You will get over it. Life will move on, and you will try again next time. That's something where when I'm talking with clients, especially if they've worked with other trainers before, or if they've like done a lot of like Googling, and they've started to like learn about how to work with reactivity, there's often a really big emphasis on making sure that your management is perfect. And something that I often see with people is that they are so stressed out about trying to get their management perfect that every single time that there's any type of slip up where they have an unattended exposure, the person has no resilience to that because they're like, I failed my dog. My dog saw a dog and he lunged, and it's over. It's never going to change, and everything's bad because I failed. And making sure that people understand that, like, that's going to happen. That's not a big deal. Your dog's going to bark at stuff sometimes. Your dog's going to lunge at things sometimes. That's going to happen. That's okay. That is part of life. There is basically no dog on this planet that is never ever going to lunge and bark at something. It's all just a question of what needs to happen in order for that dog to be pushed to the point of barking and lunging.
It's just so important to tell people that what you see, like people are posting on Instagram for the most part, the good moments, the moments where the
Yeah.
dog was totally okay and did really well. People aren't posting the mistakes that they're making, including trainers. And so that's that, yeah, like you said, that's part of life and that's not the end of the world. And it's just information for you for the future.
Yes, yeah, I think depersonalizing it and just making it data like anything else, where you're like, and today that did not go good. Why
Mhm.
did it not go good? So that you can start looking at, like, okay, what did I do yesterday? What did I do this morning? What did I do last week? Did I make any changes? Was anything different? Because normally my dog might have been able to handle this situation, but today they weren't able to handle it. So what changed?
Mhm.
And being able to understand what, what factors matter for you. What do you have to care about? What do you not have to care about? What's important?
That is perfect because I was just gonna, before we move on to decompression, I wanted to talk about resilience and reactivity. And we've already been talking about that, obviously, but
Mhm.
there's a couple things that I wanted to touch on. And what you mentioned about like what was different about today reminds me of trigger stacking and the idea
Oh
that
yeah.
if the dog is already stressy or in pain or there's something going on in the background from that day or from the past couple days, that dog's probably going to be more on edge and more likely to react. And so resiliency is really important because if your dog is more resilient in general, they're probably not going to get as stressed by as many things and have as hard a time recovering. And so if they're recovering more easily to all the little stressy things that happen day to day, they're not going to trigger stack as much.
Yes, yeah, that reminds me of earlier what we talked about when I was mentioning that often when we work on enrichment and the care routine, a lot of the reactivity drops. Resilience and bounce back is the always the first thing that I see. Generally speaking, when I'm working with a client, resilience and bounce back is the very first thing that I see that starts to improve. And then often the second thing that I start to see improve is either intensity of the reaction or duration of the reaction. Is your dog flipping out, or are they just like, woof? And they're just like
Yeah.
over afterwards, because both are technically reactions, but one is way more easy to deal with than the other. And one is also way less upsetting for the dog as well,
Mhm.
so that you know that they're more comfortable in that moment. Or maybe they weren't thrilled about it, and that's okay, but they weren't like losing their mind so much as they were just like grumbling about it and being like, yeah, I don't like that, whatever. And then often the last thing that I tend to see change is the frequency.
Mhm.
Like what I was describing with my own personal dog, Neville, where like he will still have reactions, but nowadays his reactions are he'll just like grumble to himself, maybe a little whine as he's like walking past a trigger. And then he's over it at that point in time, where that was still technically a reaction. But is that something that I can live with? Yes. Is that something that he can live with? Yes. Am I worried about him being super stressed out and having a poor quality of life because he had a reaction? No, because he was doing the equivalent of like an old man mumbling under his breath about the kids playing on his lawn, and then he like moved on with his life. That's
Mhm.
fine. That's okay to
Mhm.
have.
It made me think of like a car example would be like someone cuts you off and it's like the difference between saying like, oh, that person was a jerk and like losing your mind screaming at them, right?
Yes. Yeah, totally. Where like maybe the day where you lost your mind, it's because you got fired the day
Hmm.
before, and then you were going to
Hmm.
a new job interview, and then you spilled coffee on yourself on your way to go to the new job interview.
Hmm.
And then someone cut you off and you were like, not today. I can't handle it today.
Yeah. Let's talk about decompression. You did mention it, picking up my dog. She's gonna walk around and be loud on the floor. So you did mention decompression and the idea of decompression, but I want to talk about it more specifically. So we talk a lot about decompression walks, which is a term that I believe was coined by Sarah Stremming, but a lot of people use it now. And like I said, both of us prescribe this to clients often.
Mhm.
The idea of going to a field and letting your dog sniff and kind of being away from stressors and triggers. How would you define decompression like as a word in general when it comes to dogs?
I think I would probably define decompression as the act of letting go, unwinding, having fun, and just generally speaking, relaxing, essentially. Now, the act of decompression should lead to the sensation of safety. And I think that's a really important piece that you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, where a lot of dogs do not feel safe. Often those dogs are, in fact, actually safe. But if you were to ask that dog, they'd be like, no, every day is a new hellscape where I barely survive. And those dogs just don't feel safe. So giving them the opportunity to decompress, to feel safe, and have those moments where they can actually thrive and like enjoy their life essentially, I think is something that's so important to make sure that we are able to put that care routine into a place where you're not just like surviving, but you're actually enjoying your life with your reactive dog.
Yeah, that's a good definition. And if you think about the idea of compressing, it's like all the stress things are,
Mhm.
it's decompressing is kind of letting go of all of the things that are stressful and that are causing kind of tension
Mhm.
for the dog. The daycare example that you gave before, I think has a kind of relation to this as well because if a dog, most dogs, if they're not doing anything and they've had their needs met, are going to sleep all day, right? If the
Yeah.
dog finds daycare stressful and then also maybe is reactive or has other kind of stressy, anxious issues outside of daycare, basically, maybe they're going on a walk before daycare, they react at something, they go to daycare, they're stressy at daycare, they're not sleeping, they come home, they're never getting a chance to decompress. And I think a lot of people feel like, oh, the dog sleeps 9 hours overnight, so they get sleep and they're able to decompress overnight. But for a lot of dogs, it's just like it's not enough to recover from all of that stress.
Totally. Yeah. I think so many dogs out there are overstimulated. And I think a lot of it is just a misunderstanding. I think for a lot of like modern dog parents, we often think that we want to give them everything. We want to give them daycare. We want to give them being with us 24/7. We want to give them new toys all of the time. We want to give them the chance to meet and play and socialize with every single being that they lay eyes upon. And that is way too much for your average dog. The average adult dog, I should say, needs like 12 to 14 hours of sleep a day. And that's not including rest time. Once you start to incorporate rest time, you're hitting like 16 to 20 hours a day of your dog just chilling, doing absolutely nothing. And obviously, if they have the occasional day where they go to daycare like once a week or
Mhm.
whatever, a lot of dogs would be able to handle that just fine because it's not every single day. They have the rest of the week to come down from a really exciting um, moment in their life or day in their life. In the same way where I like to compare it to going to like an amusement park. Like if you were to take your young child to like the Peony or some amusement park and you were to do that 4 days a week and then be like, why is my child constantly like this? You'd be
Yeah.
like, well, probably because you need some sleep and you
Yeah.
maybe need to skip the Peony for a while.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
cool to go every once in a while, but making sure you understand the intensity of different types of stimulus and what you're exposing your dog to.
And I think that's another reason why a lot of us tell people maybe cut back on the neighborhood walks because if your dog is reacting multiple times every walk, they're not really getting much of a chance to recover before it's then time for the next walk and time to react again, right? And we talk a lot about completing the stress cycle, so kind of processing the stress and returning to baseline. And I think a lot of dogs just like aren't getting that. And that's why a lot of us recommend those decompression walks. And a lot of us also say, you know what, if you had a stressful walk, don't walk your dog the next day. Just do pee breaks and do like enrichment and exercise at home or something. Because it's just like if your dog is never able to kind of process that stress and recover, you're not going to have a good situation and you're probably not going to make progress.
Yes, yeah, I think that I like to, when I'm thinking about that type of concept, I often call it trigger stacking. It's not the way that I think a lot of people think of it as trigger stacking. Which did we already define trigger stacking? Did we do that already?
Yeah, I think we talked about just like different stressors. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but I think it's so important for people to realize that trigger stacking isn't just events that happen back to back, like multiple reactions on a walk. That is probably the most obvious type
Mhm.
of trigger stacking, but making sure that we are thinking about trigger stacking not only in like a minute to minute, but also hour to hour, day to day, sometimes week to week as well, and understanding how long does it take for your dog to complete that stress cycle? Because sometimes your dog can go through and complete that stress cycle really quickly if it's not really a big deal. If it was a little stressful, they can get over it, you know, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe, depending on what the resilience looks like and a bunch of other stuff. But maybe it takes them like a day or two to do that. And then if we are stacking more stressors on top of that before the stress cycle is done, we are gradually but surely but hold on, words, sorry. We are slowly but surely chipping away at resilience. We are slowly but surely chipping away at your dog's ability to deal with the world around them.
Yeah, and people don't think about lack of sleep as
Yeah.
a factor in trigger stacking, and it absolutely is. Just like it's a
Yeah.
factor for us. If we have a bad night's sleep and we're tired, that whole day we're going to be a little bit more on edge. And so if that
Mm-hmm.
dog is chronically not getting enough sleep and 9 hours overnight or 8 hours overnight is not enough sleep, then yeah, we're not going to have good results.
Yes, yeah, I think that's so important. Where that's honestly, if I were to pick one like physiological need that I wish that dog owners were more aware of, it is sleep. Because the number of people that have dogs that are just like whacked out and overstimulated, and they're just like, my dog is crazy. He's never runs out of energy. And you're like, no, man, your dog needs a nap.
Yeah.
I had this puppy client recently where this dog was chronically overstimulated, about 4 or 5 months old or so. And every time you met this dog, he was just like bouncing around. He would never stop panting. His eyes were, you know, when you meet a dog and their eyes are just like glazed over, there's like lights are on, but nobody's home.
Mhm.
It was just like that every single time. And I kept having to talk to them about being like, what is your sleep schedule like? And they kept being like, yeah, he's getting great sleep. And then we finally changed their sleep schedule. And now he has 2 naps in a crate a day, in addition to like overnight sleep and all of that. And guess what? He's just a regular guy now. You come over and he sniffs you, and then he walks over and plops down and settles all by himself. He's no longer jumping all over you and panting and teething and mouthing and doing all of these like typical puppy stereotype behaviors because he's
Mhm.
getting sleep now. And he's just like, hey, how are you? Okay,
Mhm.
bye. And then he just goes and settles.
And I think a lot of people can understand the concept of like an overtired toddler,
Yeah.
and the same,
Yeah.
especially with young
Exact
dogs
same
and
thing.
puppies. Yeah.
Yes. Down to the like, I don't need a nap protest
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about case studies. So I asked you when I sent you the notes for this podcast to think about a couple case studies of your own where enrichment, decompression, resilience, or a combination of those were an important factor in making progress. Do you want to talk about a couple case studies that you can think of that kind of have these elements to them?
Yeah. Where do I want to start? I wrote down a bunch of different options here. Why don't we start with one that kind of encompasses a bunch of different things. So I want to talk about a dog that is a rescue dog. I think I'm just gonna like skip names and all of
Okay.
that stuff.
Okay.
Who is a hound. We're going to call him Jay. So this particular hound needed a couple different things to be in place before he was really able to thrive. So the big things for this particular case were he needed mat work because he needed assistance in order to be able to settle. He also needed decompression. So he needed to get out of his neighborhood. He needed to go find a field somewhere. And now I think he's in a field like twice a week, once a week sometimes. And that's all he really needs, just to get out and shake it all off and decompress. He needed meds as well. And he also needed the right type of social enrichment. I think that was something that was really, really important for him as a dog reactive dog, is that he didn't just get shoved into daycare and with the idea that like if I just expose my dog to other dogs, everything will be okay. It's not about the quantity of the exposure, it's about the quality of the exposure. And we waited until I think like 9 months into the training plan to get him a specialty dog walker where he goes on walks with 2 other dogs. And it's the same 2 dogs every single week. But since then, that was one of the last pieces of the puzzle that he needed in order for him to be able to look at a dog and disengage all on his own and not go through fixating on the dog, body stiffening at the dog, struggling to disengage, vocalizing, all of those things that he would do before he would have like an actual like Berkey lungy type reaction. But he needed all of these things in combination, and he also needed them in a certain order as well in order to get to that point where he was able to hit those goals, where he was able to socialize with dogs. He's able to walk around the neighborhood. He's able to see a dog and decide it's not a big deal most of the time.
Mhm.
All of those things were so important for him. And for this particular case, he needed to start with decompression and mat work. Those were the important things for him in order to get to the point where we could then start asking for more, giving him the ability and the opportunity to engage with his triggers and then choose to disengage and have those moments where he can see a trigger and be like, I don't really care. I've got other stuff to do, and it's not important to me. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And one thing that comes to mind with the mat work and the decompression is like, I think a lot of people think, okay, relaxation protocol is going to make my dog relax.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're not doing the other things, the enrichment and the decompression and getting the right type of exercise and all that, it's just
Yeah.
going to get your dog's just going to be doing a downstay, basically. They're not actually going to be learning anything from the mat work when it comes to relaxation. So I just want to emphasize that to people that that's what I heard from this, especially is like the mat work was helpful to help him settle more, but it wouldn't have been helpful just on its own without addressing
Mm-hmm.
all the other components.
Correct. Yes. I think when it comes down to reactivity training, something I often end up finding is that all of the work is like the prep work, getting your dog ready to learn. The training itself usually is really simple. We go through like 3 or 4 games. None of it's complicated, and all of it's really easy to do, to the point where like I have people whose kids will do it too, like children under 10. They don't do it all the time, of course, and it depends on the dog whether or not there's like a safety factor. Because I'm not going to hand like an 80-pound dog to a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
That work, like I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
But making sure that people understand that if you set everything up correctly, training is really easy. It's really not difficult. The setup is the hard part. Making sure the care routine is in place, all the needs are met. You're also exposing your dog to the right type of trigger for the right period of time, the right intensity, the right duration, distance, all of those little detail factors. Because if you get all of that right, you have an easy breezy exposure and your dog was like, oh, that was fine. And you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's actually fine every time. And the more exposures you have where everything goes just fine, the more your dog is like, wait, am I safe? And you're like, yeah, you've actually been safe this whole time.
Yeah.
I spent the last like 6 months trying to convince you of this.
Yeah.
And you're finally being like, oh, hold on. This might actually be just
Something's
fine.
clicking. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yes, that is also
Yeah.
one of my favorite moments where the dogs first start to realize that like they're not gonna die and that
Yeah.
like everything's okay. And they're like, what? I spent the last like, 2 years of my life or whatever being like every day I barely survive the
Yeah.
hellscape of the neighborhood where 15 different dogs try to kill me every day and my owner does absolutely nothing about
Yeah.
it. And it's just me on my own trying to defend everybody, or how they're perceiving that moment in time, into being like, and then I saw a dog, and then I watched the dog, and then the dog just left, and then nothing happened. And I'm learning that I also can do that. And there is a point in time where plateaus will happen, and plateaus happen throughout training. That's something else I think that's important to note as well, is that it would be nice if it was this like beautiful upward spike of constant progress, but that is not what that looks like. You're going to have days where you're like, has anything changed? Or have I been doing all of this work for nothing? And that is totally normal. In order to help combat that, I find that behavior logs are really important. So just like write it down, write down a day in the life and then set a reminder on your phone to go do it 6 months from now. And then put it all in one little booklet. And then every, month or 6 months or whatever, however often you want to do this, go and look at it and see how far you've come. Oftentimes that really helps us recognize that everything that we are doing is worthwhile. The improvements that we are seeing in your quality of life and your dog's quality of life are worth the work.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to bring that up earlier when we were talking about changing enrichment activities and figuring out what the dog needs, is that idea of like actually having a log so that you can see on paper or on a computer what is changing. I do find that works better for some people than others because some people are just not the type of person that wants to be on a spreadsheet every day tracking things. But it can be, if you are the type of person that likes data and likes looking at stuff like that, can be really, really helpful for you to see even like okay, this day we did a sniffy walk and this type of activity at home, and how was my dog's behavior versus this day where we did something different, right?
Yeah, I think that's all very important things to consider. And data is something that is, it can definitely be a pain in the butt to track. But honestly, data is very worthwhile. If you can do it, even if you only do it, once or twice a month or whatever, it's worthwhile. It really, really can be reinforcing for the human being, because when you live with your dog, it's so easy to see the day-to-day minutia, and behavior doesn't change on a day-to-day, I want to say spectrum, but that's not quite the right word. Behavior changes week to week and month to month and year to year.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
scale that you are looking at when you are seeing whether or not change has happened is never going to be day to day, but we live our lives day to day.
Mhm.
So that's why it can feel so unpredictable.
Yes. Yeah. I always tell people like look at the trend versus the individual reactions
Mhm.
or individual days, right? Is there anything else you wanted to mention about any of these topics before we wrap up?
Oh gosh, I feel like we've talked about a lot of things. And I think if we were to go too deep into it, we could be here for several hours.
Yes.
So I think we'll call it here.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining me, Holly. This is really great. I think it will give people a lot of food for thought, especially people with reactive dogs. I will include more information on where to find Holly and her business in the show notes. And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Reactive Dog Pod. Please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review so more reactive dog guardians can find me. If you need help with your reactive dog, I offer one-on-one support, group training, and an online membership, all available virtually worldwide. Information on where to find me is in the show notes for each episode. Thanks again, and happy training.